Hello, thank you for joining the QIC webinar on continuous quality improvement. So today, our topic for today is integrating continuous quality improvement into services as usual. My name is Ashay Shah. I'm with Children and Family Features. I'm the project manager for the Collaborative Community Court Teams initiative, and I will be presenting with two of my colleagues from Advocates for Human Potential. Let's see, we had Jen Carpenter and then Kristen Davis. They're both senior scientists at Advocates for Human Potential. Just a quick acknowledgement for a Children's Bureau. This project is funded by the Children's Bureau and also our partners, Advocates for Human Potential and Children and Family Features, all that are a part of putting this webinar together. So our learning objectives today are, first of all, just to kind of set a foundation for what continuous quality improvement is, and to identify resources to support and sustain CQI, and then we'll jump into a demo of what we're rolling out, the Quality Improvement Center data dashboard. So this is really a tool within the process of CQI. So we would like this to be a foundational webinar and then kind of an ongoing learning process that we hope that you all will engage in with your evaluation liaisons and change liaisons. So again, this is just the beginning, kind of the tip of the iceberg, where we're doing a foundational, doing some foundational knowledge on CQI, and then jumping into the data dashboard. At the end, we'll provide some real-world practical examples for you all to build on. So just to put this in context, we started with site assessments and readiness for change. So we really looked at community needs at the beginning of this project, and we moved into site plan development and then site plan implementation. And now we're at phase 4, which is really pilot testing those site plans and evaluating their effectiveness. This comes at a really opportune time. We know that you all are implementing unique and innovative practices ranging from prevention approaches to expanding your target populations. So in order to better understand implementation and really guide your work, we're at a phase where data collection and data-driven decision-making really becomes more important. So just with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Kristen Davis, to jump into some of the foundational knowledge about continuous quality improvement.
Thanks, Ashay. So now that you're up and running and have implemented your programs, you can take a breath and you can begin to think about how you're doing. How closely does your pilot program match the treatment model? Is your program working as intended? Or you can just ask the question, what is happening exactly in my program? And you probably have a sense of this based on some anecdotal evidence. That is, you know that some of your families are doing really well. But really, the only way to know if your program is working across the board and for the majority of folks you're serving is to look at your data. And a great tool for that, as Ashay mentioned, is a dashboard. So this slide I'm going to get to in just a moment, but before we dive into the dashboard and how to use it and how to use it to launch the CQI process, I'd like to take just a few minutes to create a shared vocabulary and understanding of CQI, because I think folks often think it's harder to do and more separate from clinical work than it is. In fact, I'd like us all to think of it as another component of care. So this slide, the top two tiers are what I would consider something that's above and beyond the care as or services as usual. And the bottom two tiers that are going to appear in a moment that we're going to distinguish from outcome evaluation and impact evaluation is continuous quality improvement and performance monitoring. And really, CQI and performance monitoring are what allow you to get to the two tiers above, and that's in part why they're a little bit lower down on the process. Now, I know some of you are doing or have the capacity to do higher order evaluation, which is great, but what we're talking about today is really the lower two tiers, and what we're talking about is how to use data to learn and improve and maintain what we're doing, as opposed to what these higher two tiers do, which is allow you to prove your effectiveness, prove your impact. As a result, and second, really, what this means if we're looking at continuous quality improvement is something that allows you to learn, continuously be learning and improving, then I think it's really best considered as a component of care, a component of family-centered care. Insofar as family-centered care is thinking about the experience of care from the perspective of your families and a commitment to their well-being, then CQI can be seen really just as a means of ensuring you're reaching the families who most need your help, which I bring up because there will be an extended example in the latter part of the webinar that focuses on this. And it allows you to make sure you're providing care in the way that it's intended, ensuring that the expected outcomes for your families are occurring. So really, it's a different, or another, I should say, way of being responsive to the clients you serve. In addition to starting from that perspective, which I think is a little different from what you sometimes hear, CQI is often seen as an add-on, but I would really like us to try to see it as something that is part and parcel of providing services, providing care. I would also like to talk about CQI as being an approach to care. So you are continuously asking questions, stepping back and thinking about either day to day or week to week, what is it that's happening currently? What are we doing? How are we doing? And the questions can be that broad. How are we doing? How do we know that we're reaching our goals? They can also be quite specific, especially when you're looking at a dashboard. Why do we seem to have fewer people enroll every September from year to year? Or why do we have so few women enrolling, and so on? Another important part of this approach and asking these questions and knowing the answer is that you really have the expertise already. You know, we're going to provide you with a particular model of continuous quality improvement, but what you most need is asking the questions and then using what you know about what you do and why you do it to try to make guesses about what's going on, come up with provisional solutions and test them out. So I would just sum up by saying that in terms of an approach, CQI depends on routinely asking questions and answering them from your knowledge of your processes and goals. So finally, in terms of shared understanding, I want to offer a more technical, I suppose, definition of CQI. And really this particular way of defining it, or this model, is one model among several, but I think this one is very good and really kind of similar to many others that are out there. So CQI is a systematic process of identifying and describing, analyzing strengths and problems. So reviewing your data, thinking about what's going on, describing what's going on, and then testing or implementing a solution, a way of solving a problem that's identified in the data, planning for what to do, planning on how to, what intervention will solve the problem, and then implementing that intervention. And I hope intervention doesn't sound like it has to be some huge change. It could be a simple change. It's really just it could be as small as changing the way you do part of your intake, and you try an experiment and you see if changing that part of your intake in the study and review section makes a difference. And if it does, then you continue to do it. And if it doesn't, you go back to the drawing board. What else could we do? What might allow us to have more people complete the intake or move from intake to enrollment, and so on. So, whoops, I'm sorry. I guess I would just add that this circle basically shows the process of CQI, and what we're going to talk about next is getting started, resources to support this process and to sustain the process. Oops. So to get started, really the message here is that it's pretty simple. You don't really need fancy tools or a multi-person team to start, especially depending on the scope and the depth of the CQI. So to start, available reports or dashboards, really key. And as I said before, your knowledge of how your program promotes child and family well-being. That's really all you need to get started in the process. Now, to sustain the process, that requires perhaps a few more resources. You, again, will need data and ongoing. And I know for you all, sustaining access to data may mean relying on REDCap. And I know there's a REDCap webinar that will be coming up that will talk about that a little bit more. In addition to that, what you need is you just need a champion and a manager, someone at a senior level who is going to say that this has to happen and ensure that it does. Often a board member can be a particularly good person to jumpstart the process and ensure that it gets maintained if you're finding that there's not maybe not as much leadership around this as you would like. And then I can't stress enough that if you're not in a senior leadership position, but you find yourself in different types of meetings with different types of people, that regularly and consistently reviewing data at all staff levels is really a great way to start and to sustain if you're routinizing the use of data in varied contexts. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ashay for a few minutes and come back after that.
Thanks, Kristen. So this image is, it shows kind of the foundational structure that's often needed with CQI. As Kristen mentioned, it's not necessary. This can be started at any level, but having this foundational structure ensures certain things like instant information flow from the top to the bottom, and this kind of setting up this kind of feedback loop. So making sure that every level of the governing body, from line level staff to oversight, understand CQI and are seeing the results of CQI. So seeing outcomes from the work that's being put in place. So again, these are foundational structures, and really focusing in on what changes in policy and practice mean at each level. So for example, the oversight and executive committee are often in charge of approving practice and policy changes, whereas the steering committee makes those recommendations. So we're creating a communication pathways between each governing body. And really this allows for, sorry, let me go back a couple. This really allows for one more back, sorry. There we go. So it really allows for creating a culture of understanding CQI. So rather than just putting in structures or practices, this allows for changes in the way people kind of do their work. So really embracing the value of data and the value of data-driven decision-making. And it creates ownership at all levels, again, from the line level staff to oversight, really understanding and owning data. And lastly, it really creates forums for all staff members to discuss data and to kind of come to consensus on what the data, interpreting the data and understanding what the data means to their practice. So let's go to the next one. I'll pass this back to Kristen to continue to give a little bit of an explanation on some of the tools that will support CQI.
Yeah, so we've at this point we've talked about developing a shared understanding, and we've talked about some of the resources, and I do think it's important to talk about sustaining CQI. But as Ashay said at the beginning, this webinar is really the tip of the iceberg, and so we're in some ways just talking about what you need to do to get started, and dashboards as tools to support CQI is really key. So their dashboards are designed to allow you to visualize key performance indicators and perhaps other strategic data from your organization, which you will see in a few moments. Data that you've been collecting and entering, you'll be able to see nicely presented. Dashboards most often are interactive as well, so you can what's called slice. You can look at your data from different perspectives. So questions that you may have about it, you can answer by the push of a button, which we will also show. So the dashboard really is a way of presenting management with information for the practical ends or goals of the organization. And I just want to stress that the dashboard that we're presenting today is what's considered an operational dashboard. It's the most common type. You could do a strategic dashboard, a tactical dashboard. We're showing metrics that update in real time that allow you to make decisions about day-to-day operations. And typically dashboards, although the dashboard we're going to show you has both, typically dashboards will focus on process measures as opposed to outcome measures. And quickly, a process measure is something that measures a specific task or part of a process. Staff activities, for example, would be a process measure. Anything that you or your staff do is a process measure. So for example, how many sessions or visits a client has, and you count those up and you say, on average, clients are seen 4.5 times during the month. That's a process measure. It's something that you do that can be measured, and it's measured because you believe that visiting people on a regular and consistent basis will improve outcomes. And so an outcome measure is the impact that a process measure has on a client. Or more simply, it's just a measure of the impact on a person. So the number of counseling sessions would be a process measure, and you might say 4.5 seems to be the average number that someone needs to improve their emotional regulation. And then emotional regulation in that case is the outcome measure. So the main purpose here, and please, I hope if you have any questions to put them in the chat box. I all of a sudden feel like I'm speaking really quickly. The main purpose is really to provide just a comprehensive view of performance. To sum up where we've been so far, before we go into the dashboard itself, the main thing for today, continuous quality improvement supports family-centered care. It's really should be seen as part of family-centered care. CQI is also, it's an intentional approach to services where you're consciously reflecting on what you're doing and why. And then it's also a systematic problem-solving process that requires the use of information and question asking, excuse me. And I would just end this section by saying it can, CQI that is, really can require just data and one person to act on it. I mean, I realize you're in complex organizations and want to do something on a broader scale, but it is, could simply be one process, one person, checking back and looking at the data to see if those changes have made any difference. And now I think I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
That sounds great. Thanks, Kristen. This is Jen, and I will be giving the overview of the quick dashboard. It will look a lot like the dashboard that you probably received a link for yesterday from your EL, or perhaps earlier today from your EL, your evaluation liaison. If you didn't get a link, or if you click on the link and it's not working for any reason, please let your evaluation liaison know. But you don't need to have it, you don't need to have looked at it or have it open in front of you for us to go through it now here. And one difference between what I'm going to show and what the version that you have is that the version I'm going to show has all of the site names masked, so you won't see any of the site names, your own or anybody else's. So before we look at the dashboard itself, I'd like to just give a quick overview of the basic structure of the dashboard. There are 4 pages or tabs in the dashboard. The first 3 are about program performance in terms of both process, such as referral and enrollment, and outcomes. Primarily completion status is the main outcome that we look at. And across the 3 sheets or 3 tabs, we look at these things in 3 different ways. First, we look at your program alongside the other quick programs. Then in the second sheet or tab, we look at your program over time. The third one looks at your program's current status. It pretty much gives the same metrics that you look at in the first sheet, but kind of in a different way, because we wanted to give folks a few different ways to look at things and consider things. And then the 4th tab is all about data submission performance. So it's not so much about how things are going in your program itself as how the data submission process is going for you. So with that, I am going to share my screen, I think, and we will go through the dashboard. I think folks should be able to see my screen at this point. This is the first tab or first sheet of the dashboard. It's the one that shows your program alongside other quick programs. Before we go into any of the graphics specifically, I wanted to point out a couple of things. The first is the navigator down at the bottom. This is what you use to click through the sheets, the different sheets, as we're doing now. And then another feature that I wanted to point out is that for many of the graphics and many of the sheets, you can click on a particular bar. For instance, this is where your site's data will appear in your own dashboard. So say you were particularly interested in looking at child enrollment and referral and completion in your program, you could click on this bar and it would kind of fade out all of the other bars for this sheet, so that you can kind of take a closer look at that specifically. And then you just click on it again and it undoes that. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that down at the bottom here, we have a footnote that goes across all of the pages. You'll see it says that the data were extracted on the 16th. They were extracted this past Monday. And so we will be updating the dashboards probably on a monthly basis. Shortly after the program snapshot report is due, we'll update the data at that point. And each time we update the dashboard, we'll put the new date here. So that does mean that as far as your program snapshot data, what we're reporting here is data through November of 2019, because it was just recently that you submitted the November PSRs. So that information will always be down at the bottom. And then we also do have a note there about the fact that we are continuously updating data. So it's not just that you're submitting new data, but also as we continue to analyze the data you've submitted, we do find new issues with data submission. So we may be checking back with you about things that you've submitted, and then we can make corrections in the REDCap system, and the next time we run the report, those corrections will appear. So that note will be down there just to kind of remind you of that each time. Let's see, so if we want to look at the first graphic here, this graphic shows your program's target enrollment alongside other sites' target enrollment. So that probably won't change very much from month to month unless you negotiate a new target enrollment. We show this here really more sort of to provide context. This isn't necessarily a case where more is better or where all sites should be shooting for the same thing. There are all kinds of organizational and community factors that play a role in determining target enrollment. So you'd want to kind of consider that as context when you think about this. And one feature I'd also like to point out here is if you, rather than clicking on a bar, if you just put your cursor over it and hover on it, you can get additional information. And so what we're showing here is it'll have your site's name rather than saying your site. It'll let you know that you're looking at the child bar, and it'll give you the specific number so that you don't have to try and estimate the number based on the scale over here. You can get the count just by hovering over that bar. This next graphic shows the percent of your target that you enrolled to date. What you can see here is that the example site has actually already enrolled more adults and more children than they set for their target. And there's one other site that's done so, and then other sites are getting pretty close. What you want to keep in mind here is that the target is for the full grant period. So this isn't a situation where we would expect to see everybody at 100% at this point. And also, programs did get started at different times. Actually, there's a pretty wide range in how long programs have been operating. So programs that started later are, in a sense, a little earlier in their grant period, even though we're all wrapping up at the same time in September of 2020. So you want to kind of keep that in mind. Think about your program start date when you look at your percentage enrolled and compare it to other sites. One thing I also wanted to point out here, you can see a little dotted line at the 100% mark. So for the bar graphs like these that are percentages, we put that in partly as a reference point and also partly sort of as a visual reminder that you're looking, in this case, at percentages rather than at counts. So let's see, this third one here shows the percent of your referrals that you've enrolled to date. And one thing to keep in mind is that those who aren't enrolled here could be pending rather than non-enrolled. They aren't necessarily folks who either got screened out or decided not to enter your program. So if you look at the example site, they've enrolled 94% of their adults. Those other 6% could be folks who aren't going to ever enter the program, or they could be folks who are still pending. The enrollment decision is pending. If you look at your rates and they're lower than you expected, keep in mind they could be a result of any of one or more of several factors. It could be a matter of a lot of folks are getting screened out. Maybe you're getting a lot of referrals that don't actually meet your inclusion and exclusion criteria. There could be high rates of program refusal for some reason. You could be offering your services to a lot of people who are declining. And then it could also be a matter if you have a lot of folks who are pending, who you haven't made the decision yet whether or not to offer enrollment, or if your pending periods tend to be really long, like if it's not a matter of people get referred 1 month and are enrolled the next, it's multiple months, then that could also make your enrollment rates look lower than you'd expect. So down here we have a different type of graph. This is looking at the reasons for not enrolling among those who didn't enroll. So these are all people who already the decision's already made. Either you didn't offer them services or they declined them. And it's looking at the breakdown of the percentage declined versus percentage screened out or other. For these graphs that you see with they're called stacked bar graphs, where it's a single bar with multiple colors representing different categories. In those cases, we're actually showing adults and children combined, so it's individuals overall. And you want to keep in mind that these are also percentages, and if you put your cursor over the bar, you'll see the count, and that's important to kind of keep in mind for context. If you, if for instance, if you were Site A and you said, wow, it looks like we have a whole lot of people who declined, but it turns out it's actually only 9 people because not that many people have not enrolled in the program. And then this one in the middle here, that looks at, of the adults and children who have enrolled in your QUIC program, what percent have exited as of now. And so that rate could be, it's kind of all over the map, as you can see, and it can be influenced by things like the length of time the program's been operating. If the program started later than other programs, you wouldn't really expect to see a lot of folks having completed. And it could also be influenced by the expected duration of program involvement. If you plan on serving people for a long time, you may not see a lot of completions over the now or even over the course of the project. You'll probably notice that there are a couple of programs here that have closure rates at or above 100%, which in theory means that more people have exited the program than entered, which clearly isn't something that could happen. So we have been looking at that. There are at least a couple of reasons, data entry issues that we've identified that are related to that. One is that if you recall, back before we launched REDCap in May, we were asking you to submit your monthly program snapshots through Excel. And at that point, during that period, when we were collecting through Excel, over the course of the period, there are a few programs who reported more closures than enrollments. And so we're thinking it might be a matter of them having reported closures for folks that they inadvertently reported closures for folks who they may not have actually considered part of their QUIC program. We're not sure, but we'll be talking with those sites to see if we can kind of understand what happened there and get the data changed. And then we also, when we launched REDCap, we had two arms for people to enter families into, one for new enrollments, new referrals and enrollments, and one for folks who were active at that point. And we're realizing if programs inadvertently entered new referrals into the existing REDCap arm, the enrollments may not be counted here, so that could also be throwing things off. So you may hear, your evaluation liaison may be checking in with you about that if we have questions about that and need to kind of get back and take a second look at the data. And then this last one on this sheet here looks at, of those who have exited your program, what percent exited successfully or neutrally or unsuccessfully. So while the rest of the graphics really are looking more at program process, this is the one that is really looking at this point more at participant outcomes. An important thing to keep in mind is that this is, you probably recall that when we asked you to start submitting these data, we asked you to submit it according to your definition of success or lack of success. And so one of the things that we will be doing soon is collecting those definitions from all programs. So you'll probably hear something either from your evaluation liaison, or we might send out something via a group email asking you for those definitions. And then we'll be taking a look at those and kind of using them to provide a little more context for this particular graphic. And then one thing just to remember here is that you can put your cursor over the bar and get the counts. So this is a percentage, but you can see that, 28%, 28 people, 54% of the folks for this site who have exited did so successfully. So that is it for this sheet, and we can go to the next one. So this sheet looks at your program over time. And so everything that's represented here is actually your program. This first graphic here shows adults and children referred by month since you started reporting. Again, you can put your cursor over to get the specific counts. And it also shows on this sheet, you'll see the month also will pop up, and that can be really handy because just because of the way labeling works out, we aren't actually able to label each month. And so if you're wondering which month you're looking at, you can just put your cursor over and it will tell you. One thing to keep in mind with these too, if you see a gap, and you probably will, I think most programs will see gaps in most of these graphics, that doesn't mean you didn't submit data that month. It just means that, according to the data we have, you didn't, in this case, submit referrals, or for the next one, you didn't submit enrollments, which is fine. It's just sort of the natural flow of the program process. So this next one shows the adults and children who are enrolled each month. The previous one was referrals, this one's enrollment. And again, it's a very similar thing. You can just hover over each one to get the counts. And then the third one shows the counts of people who didn't enroll by month. So that, again, this is not people who were pending. This is people who there was an enrollment decision made and it was no, and they're reflected here. One thing to keep in mind too, as you're looking there's, I think, a natural tendency to sort of look at the graphs all together. And you might think that it looks like in those particular ones, this program had an awful lot of people not enrolling. But Power BI, what we're using to do this dashboard, automatically sets the scale of each graph according to the data contained in it. So if you look over here, you see that if you go up a bar that reaches the top of this graph only represents 2 people, whereas this represents 8 people and this one represents 10 people. So you want to kind of keep that in mind when you're looking things over and thinking about them. So then this graphic just shows the reasons why those folks in the previous one didn't enroll. It shows percentages, but you can put your cursor over it and get the count. And in this case, again, this is adults and children combined for this graphic. So in this case, the example program, the folks that didn't enroll during those 2 months all didn't enroll for other reasons, rather than declining or being screened out. This middle one shows the adult and child completions by month since you started reporting. And so again, you may see a lot of gaps in here, but that simply represents kind of the flow of how people are going through your program. And then this shows the status for those completing. So this is, again, percentages. It's adults and children combined. One thing it is important, I think, to look at those counts as you're looking at things. So, for instance, if you look at this just kind of off the bat, it looks like you see that everybody who completed in December was successful. Everybody who completed in April was unsuccessful. But if you put your cursor over, you see that there were 10 completions in December and only 1 in April. The two are not equivalent groups. So you can get a sense of that from looking at this graphic sort of in light of this graphic, because you do see the counts of completions over here, or you can get a sense of it by just putting your cursor over and checking out the counts on this graphic alone. So let's see, this next one looks at your program's metrics as of now. So most of these, or all of them actually, are things that we did represent on the first sheet, but we're showing them using a different graphic approach, and also just looking at yours rather than yours alongside other sites. So this graphic up here is the total count of adults and children that we're showing as having enrolled over the course of the program. So that would actually start with the data that you used to submit through the Excel sheet, and it would include that as well as the data that you've submitted through REDCap. If you look at your enrollment and you think it looks lower than you would have expected, you want to talk to your evaluation liaison about that. We have spotted a few data entry issues that can result in a reduced count. I think I mentioned earlier that we know that when there was a new client arm and an existing client arm in REDCap, that there was some confusion about that. And if cases were entered into the existing arm, they are not showing up in this number here. But we can identify, if you talk with us, we can identify that and then kind of get that sorted out and make sure that those folks appear the next time we run the dashboard. And there are a couple other data entry issues too that we identified, but we're kind of thinking those over internally, and we can talk with you about it. But if we observe it in your data, but in the meantime, if you do have questions about your enrollment number, please let your evaluation liaison know. So this graphic, this next one over here on the right, is just a different way of looking at one of the bar charts on the first tab. These are gauges, and the numbers in the middle of the gauges represent percentages. So, for most of the graphics, you're not going to see anything over 100%. But I think if you recall from the first sheet, there are several programs, and this example program is one of them, that have actually already enrolled more than their target, both for adults and children. So you can see the percentage itself by looking at this number in the middle. And then also, if you put your cursor over the gauge, it'll give you the percentage. Let's see, so down here we have the percent of adults and children who have enrolled out of those referred. And just as on the first sheet, the folks the 6% in both of these cases who haven't enrolled, those folks could have not enrolled, a decision may have already been made, or they could be pending. Then this one shows the percent of adults and children who have completed the program out of those who have enrolled. Again, it's just another way of looking at the graphic, the cross-site graphic on the first page. And then what we're showing here in this last one is the percent of adults and children exiting with a successful completion status. This one is a little bit different than the bar graph on the first sheet, in that on the first sheet, we combined adults and children and looked at all 3 completion statuses. For this one, we separated adults and children out and are just looking at successful completion status, because we figure that's an important enough indicator that people probably want to see it in a couple different ways. So, and then this last one shows your data submission status rather than any program performance indicators. This top left square here gives a count of PSRs we've received from your program, combining both the Excel data that you used to submit and the REDCap data, and then a table showing which specific years and months we've gotten PSR data from your program. If you have a fair number of PSRs and they wouldn't show in the table at this length, you will have a little scroll feature over here, and you can scroll down and look at the rest of them that way. So PSR counts are going to vary a lot from program to program, and that's fine. This number here, the 18, is actually pretty high. So we did ask for PSRs starting in November of 2018, but we also asked programs that had really started their QUIC program prior to that. We asked them to submit PSRs retroactively for the months in between November and whenever they had started. And then we also know that there are several programs that hadn't started by November, so we didn't ask them, they couldn't submit PSRs at that point. We just asked them to start submitting PSRs with the start of program services. So sites that have been underway for a long time are going to have a lot more PSRs. Sites that haven't been underway for as long will have a lot fewer. The thing that you want to look for here is that ideally your first PSR is from the month that you really consider your program as having started. So with this site would look and see, okay, our first PSR was from June of 2018. Is that when we consider QUIC services to have started? And if yes, then that's great. And then the other thing that you want to look for is that every month since then, you have submitted a PSR. So if you scroll down or you look down your list and you see a month missing, just talk to your evaluation liaison. Or if your PSRs don't start at the time that your QUIC services started, talk to your evaluation liaison and we'll figure out a way to get that data in there. So let's see. So then this middle one here, sites are asked to indicate whether each enrolling adult and child has a release of information or an ROI. So this graphic shows the % of adult and child participants that your site has given that information for. So these aren't the folks who said yes, they'll enroll in the evaluation. These are the folks who said either yes or no to that. So if you one thing too is I know there are a number of programs who told us that somebody didn't have a release of information because they couldn't be contacted or they couldn't be found. And that's fine. Those folks are included in here, even though you weren't technically able to ask them. We know that you were not able to get an ROI from them, so they can't participate in the evaluation. So this is one graphic, and that we actually are looking for sites to be pretty close to 100% on. So if you're not, it may not be possible to necessarily catch up. There may have been a period where you could not get ROIs for some reason, and some of those folks may have discharged. But if your percentages are lower, it's a good thing to talk to your evaluation liaison about and see if there's see kind of what could be done at this point to kind of maximize this going forward. This differs, the next graph differs from that one in that it shows the percentage of those who were asked that did agree to join the evaluation. So for adults, that means they signed an ROI, and for children, that means that their parents signed an ROI, and if they have a legal guardian who's not a parent, the legal guardian also signed it. Since participating in the evaluation is completely voluntary, and it's really important that program participants understand that, we don't expect this to be 100%, or in many cases it won't be 100%. However, if you do have quite low rates of evaluation enrollment, though, it might be useful to talk to your evaluation liaison about that, particularly if you're not quite sure why, and we may be able to kind of sort through some things, see if there's a particular concern that your participants are having that we can address. And then this one on the bottom left shows the percentage of families that have an entry NICFAS out of the families that we'd expect to see one for. So these would be families who agreed to enroll in the evaluation and they enrolled in your program on or after May 1st. This is one that we'd also like to see pretty close to 100%. So that was one of the reasons that we sent out relatively recently, we sent out some revised instructions for the NICFAS that we think will make it a little bit easier for sites to get those in. Let your evaluation liaison know if you have any questions about those instructions or if you didn't receive them. In a nutshell, the idea is that we are now only asking for a NICFAS at enrollment and discharge rather than asking for follow-up ones in between enrollment and discharge. And while we'd still prefer that they be submitted within 30 days, it's okay to go to 60 if you need to. If possible, if you can still base the assessment on what you learned in the first 30 days, that would be great. And then also just for the rest of this month or year, I guess, we will take an enrollment NICFAS up to 90 days after the family's enrollment date. We wanted to do that just to help sites catch up. So starting in January, that won't be, it'll be back to the 60-day time frame, but you do have a little window of time to get a few older ones in now. And then the ACEs here. This shows the percent of adults and children that have an ACEs, again, out of those who agreed to be in evaluation and were enrolled on or after May 1st when we launched the REDCap system. This is also something we'd like to see pretty close to 100%. So if you're having any difficulty with submission rates, it's another good thing to talk to your evaluation liaison about. And then the last one is the ASQ. This shows the percentage of, this is only children, shows the percentage of children with at least one ASQ out of all the children enrolled in the evaluation and enrolled in their program since May 1st. This is also one we'd like to see pretty close to 100%, but it is one that I think more programs are struggling with. And may in part be because this isn't something, we had to ask you to submit it through a different site because the ASQ folks prefer that the data be gathered through their online system. So if you're not sure how to access the online system or if you're having any difficulty submitting the data once you do access it, definitely let your evaluation liaison know. We also have a good guidance document on it that's on SharePoint. And if you haven't seen it or can't find it on SharePoint, that we can also send that along to you too. But certainly a good thing to discuss with your evaluation liaison. So that is the dashboard. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think. Let's see.
Thanks, Jen. We'll pull the slides in a bit. Thanks, Jen.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks. Excellent. Okay. Great. Let's see. Okay. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. Just a few thoughts on kind of what to look for when you're looking at your dashboard. I think we talked a lot about them when we were going through it. But you want to look for change over time in your PSR over time tab. That was the second sheet. And then there are two. The first sheet is the place to look for cross-site performance patterns in PSR data in your performance data. And then the last sheet is you can look at your cross-site data submission patterns. So again, in most cases though, as you're looking at those, keep in mind that as you're looking at kind of how other programs are compared to yours, that there may be a lot of contextual issues that many of these things aren't necessarily things where we're expecting the same thing from every program. And then you want to look at your current total enrollment in relation, if you want to, I think the most important thing really is to think about what this looks like in light of your goals and your objectives for your program. So you can look at, within the dashboard itself, you can see your total enrollment in relation to your target enrollment, But then you can also think about other goals and benchmarks that your program has set that we don't have data on. They may not be universal across quick sites, and think about how what you've seen in your dashboard lines up with those goals and objectives too. So you want to also just sort of, I think about your dashboard in context in several senses. You want to think about program characteristics, things like program capacity and community size. Both could affect referral and enrollment rates. So those kinds of things relate to what your dashboard looks like, and it relates also to how other quick programs are doing. And you want to think about events or changes, things like policy changes, program or partner staffing changes, any significant community events. All of these things could be expected to influence your program performance. And you might look at your data over time sheet, the second sheet, and see if you can see those kinds of things reflected there. And you also want to think about kind of unique events and participant flow. But as an example, you may say you looked at your closure rate, or looked at the different types of closure, and you were surprised by how high your unsuccessful closure rate was. But then you remembered that, oh, hey, 3 months ago we served a really big family, a family that had 3 adults and 6 children. Most of our families only have 1 adult and 1 child, and this big family, they had to drop out of services. Because there were so many individuals in that family, their unsuccessful closure would really shift your closure status distribution more than one of the families that's more the size that you normally serve. So those are the kinds of things that you can think about when you look and you see things that are surprising to you in your dashboard, or things that you kind of think warrant further exploration. Let's see. So just sort of in summary, the dashboard has 4 sheets, 3 of which look at program performance, 1 of which looks at data submission. The things you really want to keep an eye out for in your dashboard are things like change over time, your accounts and percentages in relation to other sites, considering the context around that, but most importantly, really the relationship to your program's goals. Let's see. So now we wanted to give an example of what Kristen was talking about, plan, do, study, act, what that might look in action with a quick dashboard. So the first step would be just looking at your dashboard, just as we just did, and thinking about both your program's process and outcome related goals. So for an example, suppose you looked at your dashboard and you noticed that your enrollment is lower than you'd like, particularly given where we are in the grant period. Once you notice that, you also go and you look at your referrals over time in the second sheet, and you notice that your referrals started off low, you had a low monthly referral rate, but then for a few months, things really picked up, but then they started tapering off again, and they're pretty low again. So that once you've observed all that, you might think about what it might mean in the context of your program and given your program's history. And this is where team discussion can get pretty helpful too. Suppose you and your team sit down and think about that, and you realize that early on in the program, you recognize that attorneys really had limited awareness and understanding of your program. So you put together an event, say a lunch, to present the program and talk through the attorney's questions. At the time, say you'd been pretty sure that you had at least a few folks really buy in, that there were a couple of attorneys that seemed pretty enthusiastic. But you realize that was now 8 months ago, and also in the meantime, one of those enthusiastic attorneys has left and taken another position. So next, you and your program think through what you want to do, having size up the situation. Yes. And so in quick programs, the interventions that you might take related to the information you find in your dashboard could be conceptualized as occurring at 1 or more, really, of 3 levels. And so the first would be change in clinical services, the second would be change in care coordination practices, and the third would be change in administrative policies or practices. The example that we're talking about suggests the need for an administrative intervention or a change in the policy and program operating procedures. So, for example, you and your program have realized in talking this through that attorney engagement really is not a one-time activity. Your initial event was successful, it made a difference, but actually it needs to be an ongoing effort. So you and your team come up with more ideas, more ways that you can engage attorneys and maintain that engagement over time. And at the same time, you also realize that having still a couple of attorneys who are already on board and are pretty invested, that's a valuable resource, and you can capitalize on that. And so you decide to invite them to increase their involvement with the program, perhaps by joining your steering committee. Yes. So having done that, you want to monitor what your plan of action. And in doing so, it's often helpful to set a time frame for observation. You don't want to necessarily go into it thinking, okay, we've made the changes that we're good to go. You want to think, when should we really expect to see an improvement? And then kind of keep that in mind as you continue to talk with your team. So you and your team would be discussing what you see in your dashboard every month. You'd be gauging any changes you see. You'd be discussing how the intervention is going on the ground as well, and then kind of combining those pieces of information to really assess your strategy for engaging the attorneys. So I think that is the end of our example. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashay to talk more about how this can fit into dissemination and program sustainability.
Thank you, Jen. So we're really excited about this. Too often we see data kind of going in, across many grants, we see data going in and kind of never coming back. And this is a real opportunity to see real-time feedback. So it's an opportunity to be able to use the data on an ongoing basis to improve your programs. Our hope is really that this will be used with your CLs and ELs on regular monthly calls, and to continue to develop these ideas of CQI and develop CQI skills as well. So thank you for that demo, Jen. And really quickly, this concept is kind of, to some degree, beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. In some regard, what we've been talking about is CQI and data being used to improve programs, whereas there's this whole other half of using data to sustain programs. And when we talk about that, we're really talking about outcomes evaluation, impact evaluation, or even cost analysis, which can definitely be done. So this is kind of setting up that infrastructure to access and house and manage your data, but going beyond that and using it for outcome and impact evaluation is really critical for your own program sustainability, but also for the field. So we're collecting this data across sites, and we're aggregating, and hopefully we'll be able to tell some great lessons from the work that you all are doing. So thank you for that. With that, no questions have come in, but we can wait a second. If anybody has questions, please feel free to use the chat function. Actually, we do have one question. Let me read this out loud. Maybe Jen, you can answer this one. It's about ACEs. So when we're displaying the ACE scores, we're not showing the number of families who have high ACE scores. This is really just about data submission, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So it's the number of adults and the number of children who have an ACEs. Yeah, regardless of what the score was.
Okay, great. We just have another one. When will the dashboard be made available to us?
So it is available now. We needed to send the links out individually to each site, and we started doing that late in the day yesterday. So if you haven't gotten your link already, your evaluation liaison should be sending it to you soon. And certainly also if you get the link and you have any difficulty accessing it, please let us know. So
great, thank you. All right, any other questions? All right, I mean, if there are none, we're available. And as I said at the beginning, this is just the foundation. We would like to, as we say here at CFS, this is a learning journey for us. So this is just a tip. Hopefully we continue to engage in these conversations and develop CQI skills. So feel free to reach out to any of us. I have the contact information here. We do have one more question. Will the slides be made available? Yes, we'll make the slides, and we are also recording this, so we'll make both available to all the sites. All right. Thank you again, Kristen and Jen, and thank you everybody for participating. Bye.
Thanks.